another book of mine, which is related on the future of social media and how we need to rebuild it. That's the other leaflet. But a copy of this book, Data Grab, is there, and it's been moving around. So they keep moving it so that everyone gets a chance to have a look at it. So I'll hand over to Ulises. So Ulises can say hi too from New York.
Yes, hello, and thank you very much for hosting us. I'm sorry I could not be there in person, but as you might have heard, traveling is becoming a bit of a hassle in the United States. But we're very happy to present our work. So let me, hopefully you can see the screen. Yeah. Great. The central argument of this book that Nick and I have written.
Ulises, I think we should just increase the sound a little bit. It's a little bit on the soft side. We're just going to up the sound.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I can control that from over here, but I will try to speak up. Can you hear me better now? Okay.
Yeah, I think as long as you project it a bit, I think it's going to be fine overall. It's not particularly loud, but it's okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, I will try to project a bit more. The central argument that Nick and I are making in this book is that we need to understand the role of data in our times through a new lens, the lens of what we call data colonialism. Which is a new form of colonialism. This basically means that in order to understand what's happening with not just social media, but also with artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency and all of it, we need to look not just at the last 50 years, let's say, of the history of networked computing, but at the last 500 years of the history of colonialism. Now, this term, data colonialism, might be a little strange to the ear. Colonialism obviously suggests something of the past, something historical, whereas data obviously suggests something of the present. Digital data, of course, suggests something of the future as well. So in order to begin to unpack this connection that we make between these two terms, we thought it might be useful to start with some statistics. We know that historic colonialism captured land. From the years 1800 to 1875, 215,000 square kilometers of territory were added to different empires as colonies every year. That's roughly the size of the country of Guyana in South America. From 1875 to 1914, that number increased to 620,000 square kilometers of territory added as colonies every year, which is roughly the size of the country of Ukraine being added to different empires. By the year 1945, we know that 1 in 3 people in the world were living under some form of colonial rule. Data colonialism, we're arguing, doesn't capture natural territory in the same way. It captures human life through this medium of digital data. And so to understand the magnitude, here are also some figures. A couple of years ago, 3 in 8 people in the world were using Facebook, and 1 in 8 were using TikTok. In 2023, it is also estimated that we were generating about 329 million terabytes of data per day. We can only assume, obviously, that that number has increased. And it is calculated that this year we will have generated about 181 zettabytes of data, where 1 zettabyte equals 1 trillion gigabytes. If you've been following the news, you've also heard about a new kind of data grab going on here in the United States, as the Department of Government Efficiency, headed until recently, it seems, by Elon Musk, has been going around basically acquiring entry to all sorts of databases from important government agencies. 15 that we know so far, including Treasury, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, the IRS, which handles taxes, as well as departments of defense, education, agencies involving aviation, health, global aid through USAID, and on and on. In many cases, we don't know the exact details of what data has been captured. But obviously also the recent announcement that Trump is very interested in hiring the company Palantir to collect and analyze all of this data gives us an indication of what its purpose might be. We have here a quote from Hal Varian that we think might also help us understand this trajectory that we have seen in the last couple of decades. In 2013, he, the Google chief economist, said, quote, that there is now a computer in the middle of virtually every transaction. Because transactions are now computer mediated, we can observe behavior that was previously unobservable. And more important to our argument here, write contracts in it. In other words, figuring out a way to commodify all of this information that these companies are extracting. At this point, it might be helpful to give you the sort of official definition of data colonialism that Nick and I work with. We say that data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit or also for social control if we're talking about governments. In other words, we're not saying all data is bad. We're not against data. We are very specifically looking at this process of extraction of data from our daily lives for this specific purpose, for the generation of profit or for social control. Now, of course, to speak about colonialism suggests that we are making a comparison with earlier forms of colonialism. And in doing so, we need to acknowledge and respect the fact that there are plenty of differences between what we're calling historic colonialism and data colonialism. There are differences in terms of the scales and the modalities, the locations, of course. Colonialism in my native Mexico was very different than colonialism in India, for example, which are also very different from modern forms of colonialism that might be happening in Puerto Rico or Palestine and so forth. At the same time, we are also saying that despite of these differences, there is one key similarity that is crucial, that is very important. That is the historical function of colonialism, which has always been the same. And that function is dispossession. Dispossession was always and from the start the key to colonialism. How does this dispossession happen? Well, by controlling new forms of territory that we will hear more about.
Yes, we'll unpack that term data territory in a minute. But most approaches to big tech and AI, which we'll come back to, have argued that they're to be understood as part of the evolution of capitalism. And obviously, there's a lot to those arguments. We don't disagree with them. But what we've consistently argued is that what's going on with data and AI is more than just another capitalist innovation. In fact, it's more even than a new stage in capitalism alone, such as surveillance capitalism. We're arguing that what's going on is the building of a new social order that does something really fundamental. It extends extraction of resource on a global scale, on a truly colonial scale, but using a new modality in a new domain, the domain of human life. And this makes sense when we recall a fundamental thing that we often forget, or that many people forget, that there would have been no capitalism without there having first been colonialism. Without the huge land grab taking the resources of a high percentage of the world that provided the fuel to make something like capitalism possible to emerge 2 centuries later. It's very convenient to forget that necessity that colonialism had to happen first for there to be a capitalism. And of course, as we know, colonialism went on developing in the 19th century with the slave plantations reaching their peak at the same time as the cotton factories in Lancashire and whatever were reaching their peak as part of the same massive global trade. And that connection between the colonial and the capitalist went on through the 20th century, and it continues today with our extremely unequal global economy and the racism that disfigures all of our societies. So if that's true, why wouldn't we allow for one more possibility? That colonialism is still developing. It hasn't reached the end of its evolution. It's developing through a new medium, which is data. This we see as the latest twist in what we call the colonial capitalist double helix that has been evolving for 5 centuries and has not stopped evolving. So a decolonial approach to big tech, it could mean many things. So just to give you some orientation, and this is a complex topic, as you would expect. We're talking about the relations between colonialism for 5 centuries and capitalism for 3 centuries. This cannot be other than complex. But let's try and separate out the levels that we're talking about. The first level of the decolonial framework, which was probably the first to be pointed out by many writers, and of course we agree with them, is that we see with big tech and data and AI today, the continuation of racial inequalities in how tech operates, who's recruited in the industries and so on, pointed out by Bulamwini and Gebru, Sophia Noble famously with her Benjamin and so on. Of course we agree with that. Of course that's important. A second thing that it's important to emphasize, if we're right, that we're at a new stage in the evolution of colonialism, is that there's a new land grab going on today, taking a new type of asset that couldn't be taken before, which is the taking of data, the taking of access to human life through data, which is what in our book we call the data grab. And if you haven't seen it yet, the book is somewhere over there. It's passing around. I got stuck. But if anyone who hasn't seen it, you can have a look. Just reach for it. That's the second level. And it's really fundamental not to forget that this too really is going on. The third level that is often forgotten as we talk about the colonialism of any sort. Now, I was just about to say something even more controversial, and Mr. Microsoft stepped, well, we've intervened. We've restored connection. The third level is really important, which is the rationalization of resource extraction that says this is all fine. We have a right to take this stuff. Now, as you are well aware, this has been a story since the beginning of colonialism. We just have the right to take the Americas. We have a right to take Australia. It's a terra nullius. There's no one there except a few 100,000 Aboriginal people who've been there for thousands of years, living perfectly well without the colonizers. The terra nullius is a very powerful legal concept because it erases the identity of those from whom the resources are taken. And that rationalization continues today, as we'll come back to. And then all those three continue alongside the other element, which is important, but often some people think this is all there is to say, which is the neo-colonial aftershock of historical colonialism, which of course continues to have to effect in the structure of the world economy, but is by no means the whole picture. We have to see these first three things as well. And our approach emphasizes the interaction between all four of those. So this is complicated. Now we move on to Ulises, who will offer an interesting way of taking apart this very complicated structure.
Yes, thanks, Nick. So hopefully it is becoming clear that we are not necessarily interested in just making simplistic one-to-one comparisons. What we're trying to do is basically establish transhistorical comparisons that allow us to see the continuities, that allow us to see how the past continues to shape the present. And when we do that in the book, we organize our argument around what is known as the 4X model. Now, you may or may not be familiar with this model. It actually comes from the world of strategy video games, like the one you see here in the background. This is actually Colonialism, the video game. It is part of Sid Meier's Civilization series. And in this game, you can play as the Spanish, the British, the French, or the Dutch. Your goal in the game is to go around discovering new territories, establishing colonies, pacifying the natives, quote unquote. And you do that by applying 4 strategies again and again, the 4X strategies. Those are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And we suggest, obviously, that this can serve as a very handy playbook for how colonizers went around exploring and establishing their conquering new territories. So what we're going to do then in the rest of the presentation is take a look at each one of these strategies in the context, of course, of data colonialism. Let's start with explore, or the process of acquiring new territories. Colonialism, as we know, was euphemistically referred to as the age of discovery. How are today's colonizing powers discovering new territories to conquer? And since we are interested in doing this transhistorical analysis, what I would like to do here is compare 2 documents. The first one is part of Google Chrome's terms of service around the year 2007. So these are the terms of service that you and I had to agree to if we wanted to install Chrome in our computers in order to browse the web. Those terms of service said in part, quote, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. Now, that's a lot of permissions we're giving to Google to use our data when we install Chrome, especially if we recall that we use Chrome not just to browse the web, but to generate documents through Google Docs, to access our emails, to share pictures, so on and so forth. So that today, obviously, when Google needs to train its AI models, it already has permission to do all of that because we have clicked that button that says accept and install. I want to compare that to a much older document, which is called the Requerimiento, written around the year 1513. This was a document read by Spanish conquistadors when they were about to enter a new village, a city to conquer, to colonize. Many times they would arrive under cover of darkness, and they would stand outside of the city limits and proceed to read this document in Spanish to an audience who obviously did not speak Spanish. The document read in part, quote, but if you do not submit to Spanish rule, that is, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can. and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children.
We've had an interruption, Ulysses, so we'll just pause for a second and just give us a repeat of some of those key words, because maybe the locals didn't pick it up, and they may need you may need to repeat that so the locals can understand what you're imposing on them.
Yes, well, you can hopefully read it here on the screen, but I was sort of saying that this document was read in Spanish to an audience that did not speak Spanish, and it basically claims that, we shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods and shall do all of the mischief and damage that we can. So I suppose if these were the terms of service of colonialism, we would be asking you to click that button that says accept and install. The point, of course, is not to suggest that what happened after the requerimiento was read is the same thing that happens after we install Google Chrome. Hopefully, Google will not be taking away our wives and our children. But the point here is to highlight the role of this abstract language, very legalistic sounding language that nobody can understand, which is basically the same thing that happens when we just skim through the terms of service, which we don't understand, and just click the button that says that we accept in order to be able to use these services. We have a much more contemporary example of the kind of exploration that big tech is conducting in generative AI, which, as we know, requires immense amounts of data to be trained. So we argue that Gen AI can be seen through this lens of data colonialism as a form of exploration, as a form of prospecting for content everywhere in human culture, content that we have created. Just to give you a couple of examples, Google's Music LM system, system in which you give it a text prompt and it generates music, a tune based on your instructions. This was trained with over 280,000 hours of music that Google did not license, credit, or ask permission to use. Similarly, more recently, we have learned that Meta's large language model, Llama AI, was trained with 82 terabytes of pirated books. So in other words, when you and I download something from the internet, we may very well be accused of pirating something. But obviously, when Meta does this, they are apparently held to different standards. And when any of these AI companies do this, which is also exemplified by this quote, which was part of a report OpenAI submitted to the House of Lords there in the UK, where they said that, quote, it would be impossible to train today's leading AI models without using copyrighted materials. In other words, our point is that when we use these AI chatbots, when we use generative AI, in many ways, we are going again through this process of accepting terms and conditions which we may not understand the implications of. Now, why do we put up with this? How is this kind of exploration rationalized? And you will not be surprised to hear that just as in historic colonialism, there were all sorts of civilizing narratives to justify colonialism. Today, we have somewhat similar narratives about this being a civilizational project. Back then, of course, we were told that colonialism was unavoidable and necessary because it would bring progress and it would bring modernity. In many cases, it would bring the salvation of the souls of the people who were being colonized. People were told that colonialism would bring peace and prosperity, and that at the end of the day, we had to accept this social order because the colonizer, in other words, white men, they knew best what was good for the rest of the world. These arguments have not changed that significantly. Today, we're told that progress is still the goal. We should accept what's happening with Gen AI, for instance, because artificial intelligence will provide a way to surpass human intelligence and the limits of our human brains. Perhaps we're not directly being told that these technologies will bring salvation, but we're certainly told that they will bring convenience to our lives, make our lives easier. We are told that these technologies will reimagine and reinvent our sense of communities. Of course, we have realized that with disinformation, that is not necessarily happening in a positive way. And at the end of the day, we're told that we should accept all of this because the CEO, the oligarch, to use today's common term, and the algorithms that they're creating, they know best what's good for all of us.
So that's level one of data colonialism, but the data colonialism game requires a lot more than that, which takes us to level two, expand, establishing new zones of data extraction. How does this happen? Through that term that Ulises hinted at before, the creation of data territories, which is a new concept that we added into our model from the previous book, The Cost of Connection. We added into this new book, Datagraph, which is still passing around. What is a data territory? A data territory is a bounded online space. So, of course, it's created through the writing of code and software. It's not a physical piece of land. But it does have a form of control that is a parallel to physical land, because the owner of the data territory, through the writing of the code that sets up the territory, is able to ensure that data will be continuously and exclusively extracted from it, whatever goes on there. So in that sense, it's a little bit like a territory, but actually the power concentrated in the owner is even deeper and greater. And these territories, as we said, are not land, they are data, but they give access to life, the life that goes on in the data territory. So some forms of data territory are very, very familiar. They're the usual platforms, apps, search engines, AI chatbots that we know about. Others are less familiar, so it's worth bringing them out. We've just picked three examples here. The first will be education, EdTech. As you probably know, a lot of what happens in today's classrooms, at least in schools, the assignments that go on there, the grading, the checking class attendance, even the management of the whole school, the assessment of teachers, all of this goes on through EdTech platforms, which are owned by distant tech companies, very often some of the big tech companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, and so on. All of that involves the extraction of data. So the whole field of education has been transformed in this way into a set of data territories. Or we could take the area of health. You may well be wearing, for perfectly good reasons, a device that is linked to an app, whether it's Fitbit or Apple Watch, that is extracting data from your single body, stored on a server with the data from everyone else's body to establish comparative statistics. Could be Strava, telling you how well you're running, and so on and so forth. That's at an individual level. But of course, at the collective level, there are dreams to gather more and more data about our bodies. In January last year, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain, published a report arguing that the NHS needs our data. And in fact, all of us should probably be wearing something like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch to do our duty of providing a continuous data stream to the NHS. Of course, the catch is that the controllers of that data is that US company Palantir that we mentioned before, which has an exclusive deal to manage data flows in the NHS with the NHS. Then, in fact, any device you've got that's called smart will be gathering data and storing it in a data territory. It could be your car, which of course is really a computer on wheels. People now find they can lose their insurance because the car, or rather the insurers who gather the data about the car, don't like how they're driving, which is a nasty surprise. Your car is smart, it's a data territory. If you have an air fryer, that if it's smart, it's been found that it could well have an app built into it owned by Xiaomi, for example, which will be sending on data to TikTok or Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok. This was reported in The Guardian, so it must be true. There are many other examples. Anything smart is part of the Internet of Things, which is basically part of a vast archipelago of data territories extracting data from you. And this is where we go back to a concept that was in our original book, The Costs of Connection, because territories only work because they can morph social relations. Technology doesn't work by itself. We have to do something with it. And the data territory entices us to enter into a new type of social relation, which we call a data relation. A data relation is a way of altering social relations so that we reconfigure social life for one end, which is to optimize the extraction of data from it for profit. And here, by the way, we won't get into too much theory, we're adapting Marx's theory of how capitalism is reproduced through labor relations and arguing that the 21st century has seen one new type of social relation, which is the data relation. It comes back, yeah. It's a frustrating device, yeah. It's not, yeah. It's looking at me significantly. Now, right, hold on there, Ulises, everything is fine, but let the owl recompose itself. So we're basically taking Marx's theory and updating it for the 21st century, and we're not just doing that recklessly, we're drawing on the authority of the great Marxist critic, Mejias Stone, who argued that's exactly what we have to do when we adapt Marxism for a post-Marxist age. Why not? Why couldn't there be a new type of relation that reproduces capitalism in an age of datafication? Yes, there is. It's a data relation. The result is that data becomes able to be abstracted from daily life and therefore enable its commodification in a way that wouldn't otherwise. And through all of this, human life becomes a direct factor, in Marx's term, of capitalist production. Can you hear me? I'm just checking you can hear Ulises, okay?
The sound is going in and out a little bit.
Yeah,
so
we had
I'm
a few
trying to keep
technical
up.
problems, but the owl has been rebelling in various ways, but back under control. So that is level 2 of the data colonialism game. Back to Ulises.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me okay. Let's take a look at the third level, which is exploit. In other words, once the colonies have been set up as zones of extraction, colonizers need to normalize certain worldviews to justify exploitation, to justify how spoils can be transformed into profit at a massive scale. And in order to tell this story, we used 3 concepts. We start with the concept of cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, colonizers had to look at the world, imagine it as, had to imagine nature as something that was cheap, as something that was free, that was abundant, that was just there for the taking. Something that did not necessarily have an owner. Yes, there might have been people living in those territories already, but those populations were not considered fully civilized. So then it was okay for the colonizer to take over, the ownership and the management of those lands. So cheap nature was the crucial starting point for how the colonizers' view of the world was framed. Because cheap nature needed a lot of labor to be transformed into wealth, obviously colonizers had to imagine labor as something that was also cheap, something that was abundant and just there for the taking. And as we know, colonialism was a racialized system. So the labor of certain populations, mostly Black and brown people, disproportionately perhaps women also, that labor was seen as, again, something that could just be taken, that was just there for the taking. So if we follow this progression, we go from cheap nature to cheap labor to, of course, now cheap data. And if we think about it, cheap data shares many of the same characteristics of cheap nature and cheap labor. Cheap data is said to be abundant, it's said to be free, it's said to be without an owner. Now, you and I might own our individual data, of course, but by the time it is aggregated, it needs the input of very sophisticated technologies that only big companies can provide. And so then the ownership of that data passes from us to them so that they can refine it, so that they can transform it and do something useful with it, which again, it is framed in terms of a civilizing narrative. This is something that's good for the colonized. This basically means, as Nick was suggesting earlier, that we are going from terra nullius, this legal concept that allowed the colonizer to claim that this was no man's land, to now data nullius, no man's data, data that is just there for the taking.
And these transformations have a fundamental impact on labor relations. The data territory, which gives total control to its constructor to extract data from it continuously, means that managers who own and set up a platform, which of course can reach anywhere in the world because we have an internet, are able to continuously exploit workers at the lowest possible price across the world. And we have a lot of examples of this because the nature of the global market means that it's particularly global South labor that is being exploited. Most invisible is the labor that goes on in training the AI. So it's not true artificial intelligence, it's human trained sort of artificial intelligence. We know about this from the work of Tim Nick Couldry, Antonio Castillis, Simon Roberts, many others who've shown in empirical detail the work of human laborers in training algorithms for very low wages. But also, most scandalously, there's the role of human beings in moderating content and social media platforms, in making sure that you or I don't see the stuff we never want either ourselves or our children ever to see, but those people have to see it every day, every hour of every day, as their daily job for some wage of $1 a day. The cases in Kenya, Sama, the company to which Facebook outsourced, which is his workers have been suing Facebook, still unresolved, is of course a very famous example of this. And this is just an example of a bigger pattern, which is that when you manage the world through data territories, you completely deepen, you add many more dimensions to the way that a manager can control a worker and the scale on which that can be done. This makes possible all sorts of exploitative practices. So precarious workers can be employed on the lowest possible wages on a global market. Of course, they're not called employed. That's also another way of reducing their rights, because they have zero social support. As we know, this was Uber's trick from the beginning, challenged, of course, in the UK courts because it was so outrageous, but still being enforced in many other platforms around the world. And all of it enforced by the continuous surveillance, which is the very nature of a data platform. It's not exceptional. It is just what's built into any data territory. It's normal in the age of datafication. So that's level 3. And now we move to the final level of the data colonialism game, the one that perhaps might first of all seem hardest to grasp: exterminate. After all, barring the last example of people being forced to watch obscene material, to clean up Facebook all day, most of this doesn't seem to involve gut-wrenching violence and mental oppression. But if we think about exterminate slightly more broadly as the elimination of alternative ways of life, then we start to see a pattern. Back to you, Ulises.
Yes, and as part of that pattern, obviously there are very specific costs that we have begun to identify that come with data colonialism. And I'll just quickly review some of these because I'm assuming you're familiar with many of them through the very interesting journalism that has been emerging in the last couple of years. We know, for instance, that there's still a lot of algorithmic bias going on, ways in which these technologies, whether they are complex algorithms or artificial intelligence, the way in which they still discriminate and in many ways perpetuate the legacies of colonialism, which discriminate against very specific populations. While we are all part of this system of data colonialism, we should not forget that some populations end up paying a heavier price in this system, and those populations are usually the same ones that have always paid a heavier price during colonialism. We know, of course, the many problems that may arise through our use of these different technologies that impact our health, whether we are talking about problems of addiction, problems of bullying and harassment that, again, certain populations experience online. All of that is, I think, a very big cost of data colonialism that we can no longer ignore, just as we can no longer ignore the environmental destruction that comes with all of this. We by now have very concrete evidence of the environmental costs, whether we're talking about the consumption of energy that data centers require, data centers which of course are becoming bigger and more visible in all parts of the world. The environmental destruction that comes with the extraction of the minerals that are needed to produce the hardware that powers all of these systems, and on and on. What we're basically talking about then is a transition with data colonialism from seeing citizens as consumers, which was already bad enough, to now seeing them basically as colonial subjects with fewer rights, with less rights than traditional citizens have seen in the past.
So building on that idea of a transition that's going on, if it's true that data colonialism, like historical colonialism, is capable of eliminating ways of life, that's how it operates, then let's look into the future a little bit and think about what sort of society this is going to give us. It's going to give us a society that restructures the world so that it values management at a distance ever more, makes it ever easier, ever more possible, and at the same time values human expertise ever less. And I don't just mean in relation to AI, but exactly what we're seeing with the global task platforms, which pay the lowest possible wage to do something that's still useful for corporations, but not on the basis of valuing the human beings who do that work. The result is that we're going to see fundamental changes in our ways of life, many aspects of them, all towards the goal of a more efficient social order. That's exactly what's happening with the pushing of AI into every institution today. We can come back to that. That is the logic. It's more efficient, therefore it must be done. To just give you one example, going back to what we mentioned right at the beginning, the attempt of the American state today to take itself apart, to reduce itself to a purely extractive core that benefits only the certain small elites, has been done through managing data, by changing the admin access on the data systems of the welfare of the US. That's how the coup happens today, through changing access to a data system, all, of course, in the name of efficiency. This is a model example of the type of social management that we're going to see a lot more of. So by now, I'm sure you really are ready for one final and different question, which is, can we do anything about data colonialism? And absolutely, we believe that we can. The last third of our book, which hopefully most of you have seen now, if you haven't, let us know and we can pass it back to you. The last third of our book is devoted to how we can think and what we can do to resist data colonialism. And one way to start is to perhaps change the voices that we listen to when we talk about big tech, when we talk about big data and AI. Why not listen to Timnit Gebru? You may well have heard of her, an Ethiopian data scientist who educated in the US, who was so brilliant that she became Google's joint lead ethical advisor on AI, but she was sacked by Google in 2020 or 21, because she had the temerity to co-write a paper called Stochastic Parrots, the Risks of Stochastic Parrots, which pointed out the environmental and social and other risks of what we now know to be generative AI, the large language models. At that time, they were highly secret within Google. She pointed out the risks and she got sacked for it. A year later, after her sacking, she did an interview with Time magazine where she said that we need to let people who are harmed by technology imagine the future that they want. How far are we from that now? But maybe that's what we need to start going towards.
Okay, and just to wrap things up, we do want to end with some specific suggestions of what we might be able to do to decolonize data. We acknowledge that what we have been sharing with you might feel a little bit overwhelming. If these problems are part of a process that has been unfolding for 500 years, what are the chances that we can undo all of the damage in the near future? But I think, and we think, that there are practical things that we can, in fact, do to begin to decolonize our data. And we actually take a page from activists in Latin America who obviously have been resisting colonialism for decades and centuries. These activists tell us that it is not enough to work at one level or to engage in one kind of action, because these are multifaceted problems. They will require multifaceted solutions, which in this case means working at 3 different levels: within the system, against the system, and beyond the system. What are some examples of what can be done in each one of these areas? Well, obviously working within the system means participating in mainstream politics. As boring or as fraught as that might seem these days, we need to continue to put pressure on our governments to pass the kinds of regulations that benefit us instead of benefiting big corporations. These might include antitrust regulation or regulation that enforces conducting impact assessments of technologies before they are released, and so on and so forth. We must not cede the ground in terms of those basic struggles. Working within the system might also mean all sorts of forms of corporate dissent, which we have been seeing recently in some very brave examples of people working at Microsoft or working at Google or Meta, raising their voices and saying, I'm not okay with what my company is doing. I'm not okay with this particular project that we're being asked to contribute to. Of course, these people, in many cases, pay the ultimate price, just like Tim Nick Couldry did, in the sense that they may be fired from their jobs just for speaking out. But corporate dissent continues to be a very important strategy. Now, of course, we're not going to assume that the system's going to change itself magically one of these days. So in addition to working within the system, we also need to work against it. And this obviously involves all forms of protest. In the book, we discuss some of them, but by now there are just so many wonderful examples from all over the world of people who are simply saying no to this process of data extractivism. One quick example, the group De Liberistas Unidos in New York City, a group mostly of immigrants who got together and organized and secured certain labor rights for doing their work as food delivery workers, working for some of these gig companies. Basically, working against the system means all sorts of politics of resistance. And again, this is something where we might actually learn from decolonial movements from the past and the present. Their struggles are, in many cases, very different from our struggles. We might, in fact, be part of their problem if we live in a settler colonialism environment. But we do believe that we can still learn a lot from the folks who have centuries of experience resisting colonialism. But whether we are fighting within the system or against the system, we're still being defined by the system in some ways. So it is also very important to imagine new possibilities, new ways of going beyond the system. This might include reclaiming colonized space and time, the space colonized by surveillance cameras, the time colonized by screens where we spend a lot of our time during the day. It might even mean reclaiming or decolonizing love, especially as we're seeing if we take into consideration the parasocial relationships that many people enter to when they chat with their AI chatbots. In some cases, even resulting in suicide, as some young people who have fallen in love with a corporate product, and then when that relationship goes sour, they are obviously very distraught. So we might need to actually decolonize love in our times. We might, lastly, need to reimagine digital sovereignty. What does it mean for us as individuals and as communities to reclaim some autonomy, to use different kinds of technologies or no technologies at all in some cases? What we imagine here is that this form of digital sovereignty will need to be reframed so that it works not just from the perspective of the state, but from the perspective of our communities. So what we are suggesting basically through all of these different levels of decolonizing data is that this process needs to be a major cultural and public project. In other words, it needs to be a large collective and imaginative effort where we need to resist data colonialism's new injustices. But we are hopeful that such an effort can contribute to the longer journey of confronting and ultimately reversing the legacy of colonialism itself. With that, here's a link to the book if you're interested in buying it, and we are happy to entertain your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulises and Nick, for that inspiring call to action. We have a room here of veteran activists and researchers, in some cases both of the above, and some who are starting out on that path. So very interested to hear your questions, reactions, hoping to see lots of hands go up. Yeah, let's have some questions and reactions. All right, yes, please. And introduce yourself, just for those who haven't met you.
Hi, my name is Yushan. I'm a first year PhD student with politics department. The question I had was about what you perceive as, with the role of like non-tech actors. And the one I'm most interested in is the state, because there's this tension of the state as both the regulator but also as the facilitator, right? Currently, like the way in which, because is that our access to financial or governmental services depend on the use and the use of phones, for example. So there is a kind of like technological lobbying that creates this very coercive need where our participation in society mandates the use of such technology, even if we choose to opt out. So that's sort of like my first question, which is like, where do you see the state in this? Because it could regulate, but it could also, facilitate these things. The second question that I had is about kind of like the difference in actors. So under, I guess, historical colonialism, the target or like the community with which the extractive relations were formed were with non-domestic communities, right? So let's say with British colonialism, it was, outside of like UK borders. So therefore there is a kind of like gap or a kind of like othering that kind of like renders the extractive relations a bit more invisible. Whereas right now, the kind of like extraction comes from within like, our own borders. So do you think like this has any effect on like, the kind of resistance or activism that can occur in a way that was different to like traditional colonialism? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. How should we do it? Do you want to?
Why don't you get started, Nick? Because
I'll start with the first one.
Sure.
Really good questions. Thank you. Well, as you implied at the beginning, there are every actor is involved in reproducing this. That's why we use the phrase social order, which underlying it has the notion of Norbert Elias, that we all reproduce a civilizing or decivilizing order. It's through interdependence that profound change happens. So none of us get away from our responsibility from this. But as you say, the state is a particularly paradoxical case. Now, there have always been states and corporations involved in colonialism since the beginning. The East India Company, the Spanish had a company that had a similar role and so on. So that's not strange. However, we can't see Ulises. Hopefully, he's still there, right? But as you say, the state is in a particularly compromised position because really from the late 1980s onwards, even in the most powerful state in the world, the US, the state started gathering less data than its corporations. That means because the state needs its territory to be legible, as James Scott said years ago, to have a legible territory, it depends on a tech infrastructure, which it doesn't supply. China is a complex case because it sponsored a lot of that tech infrastructure and it remains extremely close relationships with those platforms. But that's not true in the US. It's half true in India. India's an in-between case. So that means that we have a state. I heard a very good talk just a week or 2 weeks ago by Lisa Denchik at Goldsmith talking about the tenant state. She hasn't published this yet, but it's an interesting idea that the state is literally a tenant in the house of big tech. Where we see that playing out, of course, is with the extraordinary unfoldings in the US, with Elon Musk, at least in the early heady days of the opening of the Trump administration, literally walking around the White House Oval Room as orders were issued, sort of endorsing them or not, and extraordinary performative display of power. So we're in very paradoxical times, but that doesn't mean to say that states can do nothing. And then it depends on geopolitics. The European community taken together, if states band together, does have considerable power to challenge American tech. And that's exactly why in the first month of Trump's new administration, not just one, but two big tech leaders called on Donald Trump to impose tariffs on any regulatory authority, i.e. Europe, which dared to challenge American tech. That's what Mark Zuckerberg said in his opening statement, that he was going to drop all moderation on Facebook platforms. And this is what Sam Altman said in the Paris AI Summit the next month. Please, Mr. Trump, please, President Trump, impose tariffs on anyone who dares to use their own laws to regulate our companies. And there's been an order just imposed in the past day or two, locking that into various law of various sorts. I can't remember, I just saw it yesterday. So this is the paradox, and it's going to need some very violent conflicts and challenges for other states to challenge this. But at least the game is clearly on now. So it's up to, we'll see whether the European community takes the game on. It's not at all clear yet that it will do, but it's early days in that game.
Okay, yes, as far as the second question, and by the way, if my video is going in and out, I'm still able to hear fairly well, so I can still follow. But that was a very interesting question too. I think we sort of assume that with historic colonialism, there was a very clear demarcation between the center of the empire, the metropolis, and the colonies. Although, of course, we know for a fact that for as long as there has been colonialism, there has also been colonial migration. So that the colonized have always been in a process of moving to the center, migrating to the center of empire as well. And I would say that that process continues very much to define data colonialism. So that while there are differences, we can still speak about differences between what is happening in the global north versus the global south. And we can still speak about the differences between the centers of empire, not just being Silicon Valley, but we argue in the book also China and the Chinese Communist Party. And we keep, demarcating the difference between those centers of empire and the rest of the world. It is very much true that the global south is in the global north and vice versa. So that the impact of data colonialism is equally being felt in the centers of empire, in the Amazon warehouses in the United States or Europe, in the gig platforms, again, in the global north. So that we, I think, can no longer just speak of a very clear demarcation between north and south, east, west, colonized and colonizer. It's much more messy, which brings us also to another quick point I wanted to make, that I do think one difference perhaps between historic colonialism and data colonialism is this issue of how complicit we are in the system. Perhaps in historic colonialism, the colonized did not have much of a choice in terms of colonizers taking over territories and resources. Whereas today, we do click that button that says, I accept, before we install the software. Whether that constitutes true consent, obviously it's up for debate, but I think we do play a much more active role in our own colonization, in facilitating the process of making our lives more quantifiable so that big tech corporations can extract data from them.
Great, thank you. So I see you have a hand over here, please, and then we'll continue.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I wondered, so I'm completely...
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Merit Hammond, an associate professor in the politics department. And I'm completely with you on the colonialism argument, but I just wondered whether... So I think that you're right, that the common core of historic and data colonialism is this exploitation aspect. But of course, the historic colonialism also involved death and extreme physical violence, mass murder. So I agree that it's still colonialism, but do people sometimes say to you that almost kind of calling the data colonialism, like using that word, almost makes light perhaps of the death and the violence that was involved in historic colonialism? And then I wanted to ask a bit more about the the politics of resistance you were talking about, and because you're both communication scholars, I just wondered where democracy, so I'm a democracy scholar, so I just wondered where democracy comes in, maybe democratizing, kind of the flows of communication as a form of resistance, or is it about ideology, critique, critical theory, and so on? Do you have any more pointers on that?
Sure.
Thank you.
Do you want to take the first one?
Sure.
This season, I'll take the second.
Okay, let's do that. Yes, thank you very much for those comments. And you're right. I think, to use the word colonialism, it is certainly a loaded term. And I think we were expecting that many people's reaction would be to protest the use of that term, in the sense that, as you pointed out, it might be taken as a way of erasing the great physical violence that went on, the genocide that went on in historical forms of colonialism. To our surprise, actually, what we have found is that many people from the global south and who come from former colonies find this term very useful in the sense of, again, establishing these continuities. We highlighted the point that we're not making one-to-one comparisons. So we cannot suggest that the genocide that ended in the destruction and elimination and extermination of 95% of the population of the American continent, we're obviously not suggesting we're going to see a repeat of that. But this lens of colonialism still, I think, speaks to many people in the global south, and they adopt it as a useful lens to try to understand what's going on. We do, it's true, err on the side of caution in terms, again, of making sure we're not making these one-to-one comparisons. But once we've done that, we do point out that this is still a very necrophiliac system. There is a lot of symbolic violence in data colonialism, but we must not forget the fact that there is also very real, concrete forms of physical violence, of real violence that are felt. In the United States, for instance, researchers have calculated that if you live below the poverty line economically, many aspects of your daily existence are already being determined by algorithms and by artificial intelligence, and not in a positive way. So whether we're speaking about access to health services or access to other services, including services that may have to do with child welfare or domestic violence, things that do have very real, concrete impact on how people experience violence in their daily lives, that is already being mediated by some of these systems. So I think there is definitely, we argue in our work, a very real and present dimension to the violence that some people feel in this system. Again, you and I, we might live in a privileged environment where those impacts might not be as deeply felt as other populations, but we do have to keep in mind that this is a continuation of the colonial legacy of that violence, which is felt more deeply felt by some.
Yes. It's okay. It's the owl explodes at various points. But anyway, that is such an important point about violence, which of course we, in writing this book, it's something that we thought a lot about, because we're absolutely against the idea of using colonialism as a metaphor. Strongly, this is too important to reduce to a metaphor. It's a real thing that happened over 500 years of history. So it's a question of reality, whether it is continuing. It's not a matter. Our argument is that it is in certain dimensions. And so what we're trying to hold open, and you may well have doubts about this, and everyone is differently positioned. I'm from the white colonial center, so it's clearly a different thing for me to say these things than it is for Ulises or any of you. So, but nonetheless, we are trying to hold open the possibility that colonialism is not over. It was already a very complex thing. It changed massively and developed over 500 years, and some of its key elements are still continuing and evolving into new forms. And that's the thing we have to hold on, because we think that actually matches the reality. And going back to the previous point, matches the reality of people across the world, not just in the former colonies. Akil Mbembe, the African philosopher, talked in one of his books, The Critique of Black Reason, of the becoming black of the world. We cite that in our latest book. It's a shocking statement, paradoxical, but he's trying to point to the absolute subjection, as Ulysses put it, of bodies to data power is something that is starting to become a broader experience. And that's what he means by the becoming black of the world. So we believe this is a real phenomenon, so that's why we hold on, in spite of the difficulties of doing so. But that also leads to the next thing about democracy. Where is democracy in all of this? The state is compromised. Political parties, by definition, are compromised. I've been reading Karen Howe's excellent journalistic book on OpenAI, where she reports how Chuck Schumer, the chief Democrat in the Senate, was always down at OpenAI, praising Sam Altman for his wonderful business deal-making skills. Completely co-opted. Not a surprise that we don't have adequate regulatory action from the Democratic Party, is it? So our systems are compromised, which means that resistance initially, we would expect it principally, and this was our model, our three-level model, with, against, and beyond, is going to come from outside the system. It's going to come from communities. One example, my book on social media is arguing we need community-based social media, not to abandon connection, but to reimagine it from actual communities, from where it can be built on a more secure and manageable basis. And also it links to solidarity. Solidarity across borders, solidarity, even though you're a middle-class academic worker, with the Amazon worker on the warehouse floor who moved your books around in a warehouse probably not a few miles from here down the M40, that's moving your books around so they kept your house on time. We need to create new forms of solidarity which recognize hidden but important commonalities and differences as well, because without that we won't be able to build the resistance that is absolutely necessary. So it's both within and beyond democracy that we're going to have to find this resistance, I think. Right now, more beyond than within.
Yeah, clearly, seeing the results of democracy in many countries. Let's take another look at the video there. We see to Oswego. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Minister Chen. I'm a research fellow in the law school with a media studies background. I just wanted to just get your reflections. I like the points you mentioned about the resistance, the 3 dimensions that you mentioned. My question is, how do you see sacrifices? Because if you think about with historical colonialism, it has to take political sacrifices, but also quite real sacrifices in terms of the stuff we're talking about now, which are quite violent, etc. But in your own reflections, I guess I know that you have also tried to set up some movements. What are reflections in terms of what are the things that we can let go in this sort of like resistance project? Thank you.
Could you hear that, Ulysses? I can't tell.
It was a little hard. Do you want?
I'll summarize it for you, and then maybe I'll start and you can. It's an important question from Tatende, who's a research fellow in the law school here. And he's asking us fundamentally about resistance, but in particular sacrifices, or if you like, trade-offs. What trade-offs are we going to have to make in this very complicated situation? What can we let go of in order to advance the possibilities of resistance? Perhaps I should start, because since you just heard it. These are very difficult questions. So in the book, we refuse to preach to people and say, you must leave this platform, you must do that. Who are we to judge what any of us is to do? If you are dependent on 2 or 3 jobs, all of which come to you only through apps on your smartphone, which you can't afford, but you have to have. We're not going to tell people to stop using a smartphone, of course not. So everyone has to face this from where they are, and it's an extremely unequal field that we're looking at. But at the same time, the one thing we cannot get rid of is face-to-face community building and resistance from dialogue, which is not to say that we can ditch the digital. We're absolutely not saying that. There's always this debate about whether you can dismantle and rebuild the master's house with the master's tools, the famous phrase from Audre Lorde. And it was a provocative question, but I don't think there's been any time in history when a revolution or a massive change can happen without using some of the master's tools. Marxist revolutionaries sold pamphlets, created books which could be sold through the book market, and so on. It's not possible to do away with all the tools in order to create a new. You have to accept some of the tools which are lying around. So I think it's a matter of balance, and that's why we stress the 3 pillars of resistance: within, against, direct opposition, and beyond. Thinking beyond as we stay up on the face of it within. And I think a lot of people are experimenting with this today. There are more and more people saying, not only they're dropping their smartphones, but also they are trying to emphasize the face-to-face. You may have seen that statistic, a very strange one. Young people in Britain, 46% were reported in a recent survey to say they would want to go out without the internet. I mean, that's not something one can dismiss when that comes out of a survey. I don't know how the survey question was phrased, mind you, but it's a very interesting paradoxical statement of a sort of cry of pain that paradoxically, we need to find different ways of going on, which don't dispense with everything we know and we need. So with Palestine, we cannot say that people shouldn't be using social media to exchange images of the atrocities. Of course, we wouldn't dream of saying that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean to say social media are the answer to that problem, because they are toxifying media because of the data extractive space. So we have to live these paradoxes and share them and work out together how we relate to them. But in that sense, it's the same as with capitalism. We have to live the paradoxes of capitalism. So in that sense, it's not completely different from that. That's the best I can do. Ulises, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So I will attempt to also respond. I mean, in my mind, very clearly, sacrifices are demanded by colonialism and capitalism. Sacrifices is what sacrifices come with putting up with colonialism and capitalism. In my mind, resistance does not require sacrifice. Because resistance basically, to paraphrase another author, basically it means an ontological reintegration of the individual to the world. It means coming to terms again with the joy of being human and communicating and collaborating with other humans, which is something that these technologies and these corporations have tried to rob us of. Not that the technology is bad, because in many ways it can be used for collaborating and communicating with other human beings. But when the foundation of it is extractivism, then obviously we have a problem. All of this to say that I think instead of thinking in terms of sacrifices, we need to think in terms of imagination. Imagination as the most important and fundamental tool of resistance to colonialism. Because when colonialism could not be resisted with the body, it could always be resisted with the mind. And if you have heard the blues and jazz, and if we have heard hip hop as cultural responses to oppression, then we can see that, the very crucial and important role that culture and that imagination can play in resistance. So, I mean, forgive me, I'm shifting the terms a little bit, but that's why I choose not to necessarily think so much in terms of sacrifice, but in terms of the cultural imagination that we can invest in resisting data colonialism.
That's really beautiful thought. And I know there's many more questions. And I really apologize. We don't have time to get to them all. But I do think this is a perfect note on which to start to wind things up, to think about the joyful nature that we can find in resistance and in community, about reclaiming space, reclaiming voice, reclaiming dance as ways to resist. I want to encourage everyone who hasn't already to get yourself a copy of Data Graph. I think someone still has a copy that's floating around the room. Make sure we get that back to Nick. There it is. Oh, it's already halfway through it. And also, I just want to plug Nick's sole-authored book, The Space of the World, Can Human Solidarity Survive Social Media, and What If It Can't? Provocative title. So that's also available for you to check out. Really huge thank you both to Nick and Ulises for overcoming technological hurdles and geography and time to come together for this wonderful talk. Also, thank you to Erica Kendrick, Sarah Doughty, and Ian Emsley for support today for this event, and to IGSD for the support, as well as many departments, law school, PACE, the Spotlights who helped to spread the word. Please sign up to SIM's mailing list if you haven't already. It's on our website if you want to come to more talks in 2025 to 26. We'll have many more, and our socials on Blue Sky. We will now move over gracefully towards the Fab, reclaim the space there, and continue talking to Nick. So please join us for a drink, a snack, and a chat. And yeah, thank you again very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Hi, Ulises. See you tomorrow or Friday in Madrid. Except we'll be me in Madrid.